daily life. Forgive us that we so often are ungrateful, complaining, and discontented. Take for granted your greatest gifts, the blessings of health, the comforts of a wonderful nation, our home, our family, and the joys of friendship, and the beauty of the world around us. Teach us day by day to number our blessings, to receive each of them as from our Father's hand, fill our lives with gratitude, our lips with praise, for the sake of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
This House is in session. Minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday, June 21st, 2022, and Tuesday, June 28th, 2022 to be confirmed. Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that the aforesaid minutes be confirmed.
The question is that the aforementioned minutes be confirmed. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. The aforementioned minutes are hereby confirmed.
Announcements by your Honourable Speaker.
I am in receipt of the Auditor General's report of 2021 and the reports of the Auditor General on the financial statements of the Government of Barbados for the financial years ended March 31st, 2020 and 2021.
Messages from Her Excellency the President, petitions, papers.
Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Speaker, I'm commanded to lay the Barbados National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan for 2020.
Government notices, private members' notices, notices of questions, reports from select committees, first readings of bills, statements by ministers, congratulatory and/or obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, oral replies to questions, notices of motions for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, subsection 5, 43, and 44 for the remainder of the day's sitting.
The question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. The aforementioned standing orders are hereby suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Government business, sir.
Government business is the order of the day.
Order number 4, in the name of the Honourable Minister of Labour, Social Security and the Third Sector, to move the second reading of the Safety and Health at Work Amendment Bill 2022.
Honourable Member for St. Peter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise this morning to lead the debate on the Safety and Health at Work Amendment Bill 2022, reflective, but also wanting to share some perspectives with this honorable chamber and with the people of Barbados. The Safety and Health at Work Act, practitioners refer to it quite often as SHAW, Safety and Health at Work, is a 2005 piece of legislation. I say that to indicate that it came into being during a previous Barbados Labour Party administration. And the reason why that is important for me, because I stand to lead debate as the minister responsible for labor matters. That includes industrial relations and occupational safety and health, among other matters. But I also stand in this place as a member of the Barbados Labour Party and as the representative for the people of St. Peter. The party that forms the government, the party that I'm happy and proud to be a member of, is a political organization formed out of intense worker dissatisfaction in the 1930s, formed out in the local context of a revolution. And I say revolution in its broadest context because change, qualitative change was effected, but people also lost their lives, including people from St. Peter. Out of that revolution, celebrated, we recognize Clement Payne, the Right Excellent, and his contribution. Coming out of that upheaval that led to revolution was the action of the Right Excellent Sir Grantley Herbert Adams and his recognition that the movement forward in terms of lifting the standard of life, if at that point you could call it standard of life, but moving working people forward, lifting working people up. He recognized that there needed to be an organization that would facilitate that movement, that would facilitate the improvements that Clement Payne, but not just Clement Payne, the masses of people were looking for. And the Moyne Commission recognized that Clement Payne was leader of a movement. And that movement was a movement at the grassroots, a movement of people who were working, but still finding it difficult to survive. Difficult to survive from a financial perspective, because they were getting, as we would say, net skin to nothing. But workers who were also suffering from the perspective of their health, who were suffering from the perspective of their safety, who were suffering from the perspective of what is called in Shaw their welfare. And this is the period out of which the Barbados Labour Party emerged, and Sir Grantley Herbert Adams as its leader. And I want to share, Mr. Speaker, that the soul of the Barbados Labour Party is wrapped up, bound up inextricably with the working people of this country. And I'll go further to say our history and our soul is bound up inextricably with the working people of the region, the working people of this Caribbean civilization. And I say that latter part because we reflect on the position taken by Sir Grantley Herbert in relation to bringing the parties in the Caribbean, the governments that represented the working people, bringing them together so that there could be greater improvements in the lives, in the existence of the working people of this country. Out of that effort emerged the Barbados Workers' Union. Again, a recognition that while there is a political organization, the working people of the country needed specialized and more focus, more specifically targeted institutions that would push the envelope, that would push for improvements in the rights of the members, workers of this country. And so emerges in the very early 40s, after 38, when this party is formed, in the very early 40s emerges the Barbados Workers' Union, led also by Sir Grantley Herbert Adams, Sir Hugh Springer. Those who led the political party also led at that time the Barbados Workers' Union. We see, in terms of the legacy and soul of this institution, adult suffrage. And adult suffrage is important for working people because those who owned land, those who could be considered capitalists of the time, would have been able to participate in the election of persons to sit in this honorable chamber. Considered honorable then, I'm not sure if we, based on that kind of discrimination, would refer to it as honorable, but I know that it would not be right for me in this, your chamber, Mr. Speaker, to refer to any other incarnation as any less honorable. But I think you and the public and my colleagues understand what I'm saying. Adult suffrage allowed working people who owned only their labor, it allowed them to participate on equal footing with those who owned large tracts of land, those who owned the Pleasant Hall plantation of St. Peter and the Allendale, which was one of the grand plantations in St. Peter. Those who owned lots of land are now in a position where those who are working have the same right to determine who will lead them and to determine the agenda of the legislature, which is populated by those who are elected to lead. And so we get adult suffrage coming out of that. And I'm going through this, Mr. Speaker, because what we've come here today to debate is not a one-off. It is the continuation of a legacy that speaks to a focus on working people and uplifting the working people of this country. We have, in 1981, there is the National Insurance Scheme established in 1967, and this year we celebrate 55 years of the existence of the scheme. That scheme provides pensions, but in 1981, this Barbados Labour Party, under the leadership of Tom Adams, implements the unemployment scheme. And that is important because there is a recognition, and I'm going to speak to this a little bit later, but there's a recognition that very often, when times get tough, the cuts go first to workers. and workers are often and I don't know how nicely to put it, but the first on the sacrificial altar. Thank you for whoever, I know we don't hear sides, but I heard something. It wasn't on the side, it was something. Workers are often the first to be put on the sacrificial altar. And Mr. Speaker, it is not usually a situation like that found in the book of Genesis, where Abraham is about to offer his only son. But before he offers his son, God provides an alternative. In the capitalist society in which we live, or some people may say forced to live, workers are often placed first on the sacrificial altar, and in some cases, their economic lives taken. Out of that understanding, a previous Barbados Labour Party government put unemployment insurance, that is essentially what it is, an unemployment scheme, into place, 1981. Again, a recognition that workers are people, that workers need to survive, and that we as an institution are duty-bound and morally bound to look after the workers of this country. And there are a number of other developments that we could speak to. The opening of polyclinics. You know, Mr. Speaker, polyclinics were not open for people like the person you are today. It is not open even necessarily for me today. But polyclinics were open recognizing that there were people who can't just pick up the wallet or billfold and go to a private doctor and pay $100 for a 5-minute consultation. Then you're told, well, you go outside to the secretary and carry this file, and you pay the $100. Polyclinics were set up because working people in this country needed health care. They're human beings. They needed health care. Polyclinics were developed by this Barbados Labour Party for that particular reason, because our soul is bound up with the working people of this country. This party also took on the mantle of developing workers' financial institutions. And I had the privilege, along with the Honourable Member for St. George North, of spending 2 weeks in late May, early June, discussing what is called, and as a matter of fact, helping to produce, we kind of took the lead, Barbados took the lead, in helping to produce the first international document that defines what is called the social and solidarity economy. Our credit union movement is part of that economic construct. Institutions that are economic in nature, but not driven solely by a desire to generate profits for a few. And so not the emergence, but the development of the credit union movement and the moving of that movement into the space of what could be considered credible financial institutions. Because, Mr. Speaker, back in the day, those of us who are old enough to know, those institutions were seen as, the poor people institutions, no credibility. And even in more modern times, we have attempts by the traditional financial sector to discredit the credit union movement. And I have felt, and this is a personal, even though I stand as a member of the Barbados Labour Party, but this is a very personal reflection. I have for a long time, been a little bit upset that governments continue to kowtow to some degree to those who would want to suggest that workers' organizations don't have the capacity to manage like those in the traditional commercial sector. And that is something that we have to change. That change will take some time, I understand, but we have to remain focused on that. The credit union movement across the world, the credit union movement in this country is a credible institution. It represents the aspirations, the desires of the working people of this country and working people around the world. This Barbados Labour Party is the party that moved the credit union movement in a qualitative way along the road to the credibility that it still seeks in this country. We have, Mr. Speaker, the Tenantry Freehold Purchase Act. Legendary. Legendary. But, Mr. Speaker, the Tenantry Freehold Purchase Act was not designed to assist those who own the land. It was designed to assist working people who, in many instances, are living paycheck to paycheck. And back in those days, pay packet to pay packet. And in some cases, an old envelope to an old envelope. Whatever it is that your boss put your few coppers in. That act is part of this government's approach, this party in government, part of our approach, part of our soul, because we recognize that our soul is bound up with the working people of this country. I thought it necessary to use these examples because from time to time, those who listen to us, and when I say us now, I mean those who are who are politicians. Those who listen to us sometimes feel, and I know that feeling intensified in the 10 years before we came into office, but they sometimes feel that we say things that sound good, but there is no empirical underpinning. There's no necessary substance to what is being said. And that is the reason why I thought I needed to share those examples with this honorable chamber. I also have to say, Mr. Speaker, and this is something else that I feel very strongly about. I've come to the office of Member of Parliament for the constituency of St. Peter, recognizing that I stand only because of some giants who went before me. And I'll mention first the first tradesman, the first tradesperson, to use a more acceptable term, the first tradesperson to enter this honorable chamber, 1944, J.T.C. Ramsey. And he came in not dressed like me, and sometimes it makes me feel guilty. He came in not even dressed like the honorable member for St. Michael East. He came in his tradesman overalls. A predecessor of mine making a statement that this country is for everybody, including those who wear overalls, including the working people of this country. I stand on that legacy. I also stand, Mr. Speaker, in this place on the legacy of the now Right Excellent Frank Leslie Walcott, a St. Peter man, a Farm Road St. Peter man. And I have constantly to say that because there are those who somehow feel he's from St. Michael. He got his grounding in St. Peter. But I stand on his shoulders because as a very young man, he recognized, he represented St. Peter in the House of Assembly, in this honorable chamber. But he also recognized the soul of the party. He understood before personality issues got in the way, he understood that we are here to represent the working people of this country. And so he, both in Parliament and in the Barbados Workers' Union, defended the rights, defended the status of working people and sought to uplift them, sought to raise their standard of life. I also stand here, Mr. Speaker, on the shoulders of Sir Kenmore husbands, KNR husbands, Doc husbands, also a representative for St. Peter, one of your predecessors, the first black man to be the Speaker of this honorable chamber. And he also was involved in the trade union movement, an assistant secretary to Sir Frank Walcott. And I say that because I am not in the business of ad hoc, one-off. Whatever is done by this party and whatever is done by this member is done in a context. It is done with the understanding that we ain't just come. We've been here for a long time, but to do the same thing, to represent the working people of this country and to uplift those people who put us here, who are depending on us to amplify their voices. They have voices. It is not that they don't have voices, they have voices. They are often not heard. We have been sent here to amplify the voices of the working people of this country. In more recent times, since we've come back to office and since I've had the honor to be the minister responsible for labor matters, we've been able to pass and proclaim the Employment Prevention of Discrimination Act, an act that says discriminating against people is just wrong. It is an act, Mr. Speaker, that is really a natural successor to what Sir Grantley Herbert would have been doing in 1937 and 1938. You cannot treat people how you feel like because they're lesser than you, because they look different from you, because they talk different from how you talk. Discrimination is just not on. And this party has been able to pass and to put into effect the Employment Prevention of Discrimination Act. We were also able, as a party, Mr. Speaker, to enact for the first time a national minimum wage in this country. A recognition, Mr. Speaker, that those who work are human beings. They gotta eat. They gotta pay the light bill. They gotta pay the water bill. And even the people, Mr. Speaker, in Boscobel, even when they're not getting water, they still gotta pay a water bill. The national minimum wage was put into effect, recognizing that not just the owners of capital, not just those in the upper classes, but working people have to be able to live. Now, I say that, and just let me qualify when I say have to live, because I am aware that a minimum wage is not necessarily a living wage. And there are differences in the definitions. I wouldn't go into that at this point. But there are differences in the definition. But a minimum wage represents for this party in government, and represents for this minister for sure, a step in that direction, in ensuring that the people of this country, the working people of this country, are able to survive in this country as they provide labor for those who are employers and business owners in this country. I should also update this honorable chamber to say that as we speak, within the office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, there are two pieces of legislation. There is, Mr. Speaker, the labor clauses, well, when I say two pieces of legislation, there are two draft bills in the office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel. The Labor Clauses Public Contracts Act is one of them. And if I just briefly to say that the Labor Clauses Public Contracts Act is an act based on an International Labour Organization convention which speaks to certain minimum standards that those businesses that enjoy the benefits of getting contracts, of being awarded contracts paid for by the people of this country, there are certain minimum standards that must be met by those organizations as it relates to the treatment of their workers. I came to office out of the private sector, recognizing and understanding, and this was in my mind before I even became an elected member in this honorable chamber. But I had cause to interact because in the hotel industry, there's always construction or renovation going on. I had cause to interact with a number of construction companies. And I recognize that not all of them were equal. And I'm not referring to equality in terms of assets. I'm not referring to equality in terms of capital structure, in terms of number of employees. I'm talking about equality in terms of how they treated those who worked in the organization and those who helped them to accumulate more capital. There were some organizations that simply did not treat their workers as human beings. And some people are getting tied up thinking that not treating your workers as human beings mean that you're spitting on them. This is 2022. We're not talking about people walking about spitting at or cursing people. If you refuse to allow your workers to be covered by Social Security, it is, Mr. Speaker, as far as I'm concerned, the equivalent to cursing them or spitting at them. Social Security is what keeps people when times get tough, when they're unemployed, when they're severed, when they reach pensionable age. And so I know there are a number of people who've been getting their knickers in a twist because of some of the statements that I make. But I make no apology. I make no apology for anything that I say because I've grown up, and God bless the memory of my late father. I've grown up to speak the truth, as he would say, and it is interesting that as Christians we say this, come hell or high water, we speak truth, and we are prepared, and he has taught me, you speak truth even to power. Now, that Labor Clauses, Public Contracts amendment, a draft of which is currently in the CPC's office, will ensure, for example, that employees, once it is established that they're employees, must be treated as such. Social Security, pay as you go, income tax deductions, whatever the case may be, they have to be treated as such because those businesses are benefiting from the taxpayers' dollars of working people in this country. And that is what the amendment to the Act will do once it comes into force. It will ensure, working along with the Inspectorate of the Ministry of Labor, located in the Labor Department, it will ensure that people are treated as people. There is also a draft piece of legislation, an amendment, in the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, which seeks to amend the Protection of Wages Act. And I just want to mention one thing, one component of the proposed amendment. When a business finds itself in difficulty and has to be wound up, at this time, workers could be left high and dry, outside of the benefit that some creditors, I should say some other creditors, the benefit that they will receive. And so part of the amendment that we are seeking to make will protect working people in this country if the unfortunate materializes. And so, Mr. Speaker, I mention those again because the soul of this party is with the working people of this country. We are bound to represent, to support, to uplift, and to protect the working people of this country. In our ministry, there are a number of other things being worked on. The Employment Rights Act, there are some amendments to be made to that act. The Employment Rights Tribunal, which is established by the Employment Rights Act, that is a system of justice, a structure to dispense justice, but has operated for quite a number of years without rules. And we're in the final stages of preparing the rules to govern the operation of the Employment Rights Tribunal. We are also, Mr. Speaker, in the process of reforming the tribunal system, or examining how it could be reformed. And while we were at the International Labour Conference, we engaged with I think there were two departments of the International Labour Office, and the office will be providing for us some resources that will help us in working through how we will restructure so that we can have a more full-time, or maybe a full-time, a more full-time may be oxymoronic, but we can have a system that is more effective and efficient in delivering timely justice to working people. We are also working on the Recruitment of Workers Act to amend that, because there has to be protection for workers and those who want to work. The Recruitment of Workers Act does a number of things. It speaks to forced labor, but it also speaks to regulating employment agencies. And some of us will remember that some years ago, there were persons who were promised jobs in Canada. Some people resigned from work, flew to Canada, and then found out that there were no jobs. These are matters that have to be addressed. And they have to be addressed by us because our soul is bound up in the protection of working people. And so these are things that we have to do. And the other piece of legislation that we are working on assiduously as we speak is the trade union recognition legislation. That is important. I heard the comment ever since. Long in coming, but it is on its way. We've already received cabinet approval for its development. We've had our first engagement with the social partners and the Labor Department, the Office of the Chief Labor Officer, has indicated that that department is in the final stages of working through all the submissions that have been received so that any adjustments can also get cabinet approval and go to the office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel so that we can have a draft which we can take back to our social partners and have discussed before we bring it to this honourable chamber. This, Mr. Speaker, represents what we have been called to office to do. We have been called to office, the Barbados Labour Party has been called to office to represent the working people of this country, to uplift the working people of this country, and to protect the rights of the working people of this country. The amendment, the bill before us today is the Safety and Health at Work Amendment Bill 2002. There are a number of reasons for the amendment, but if I may touch just briefly to say that this is another piece of legislation that I've wondered about and knew that changes were needed. Well, not changes, it needed to be augmented. Even though in my previous life I operated in finance departments, I also, as I developed and as my mind developed, I didn't have an epiphany because I think it was part of my grounding. But I recognize that the management of people is more important than the management of money and resources. And so I forayed into the realm of what is called HR management. And the Honourable Member for St. Michael West Central, I often credit him, and I can say it now because I like sometimes to blame people. If I mess up, you can ask him what he taught me. But very early on, I decided to foray into what is called HR management. And one of the things that kept causing problems was trying to interpret some of the clauses in the Safety and Health at Work legislation. Clarity was needed. And so one of the things that we are doing parallel to debating this bill that is currently now before this honourable chamber is enacting regulations to the Safety and Health at Work Act. And I said that only to indicate that this is an issue that has been outstanding for a while, and it is one that has to be addressed. Safety and health at work has always been important. Mr. Speaker, most people spend most of their waking hours at work, either in the workplace, traveling to work, traveling home from work, thinking about work. Most of the working hours, the waking hours of working people is spent connected to work. And so, safety in the work environment, health, those things that are in the occupational space have always been important. And they're important because they deal with human beings. That's what makes them important. I think much of the rest of the world came to recognize during the pandemic that occupational safety and health matters. You know, we developed terms like frontline and essential, and, you know, almost all work is essential. But it takes a pandemic, it takes people dying, it takes countries shutting down to allow some people to realize that workers are important. But I'll use the cliche, even though I don't like using cliches. Let's not waste the pandemic. Too many people have died. And so let us, as we emerge from the pandemic, hopefully, let us always remember that workers are important. Wherever workers are important. During the initial days of the pandemic, so this is in maybe the second calendar quarter of 2020, the social partnership started to use the phrase, safe people doing safe work in a safe environment. And that became our focus. And the order of statement is not by accident, because people are the most important. The workers are the most important. They're not the only components, but they're the most important, simply because of their humanity. Safe people doing safe work in a safe environment. In the Caribbean region, and maybe in the Latin American region, Barbados has always had, well, Barbados has, let me not say has always, Barbados has a decent reputation in its approach to occupational safety and health. And the Labor Department, in particular, in the Safety and Health section, has been called upon on a number of occasions to offer assistance to fellow Caribbean countries in assisting them in lifting their standard of occupational safety and health. And so we are not starting fresh. There is a foundation upon which we are building. So we've had to share expertise with persons, and we, I believe, have also learned, because as you teach, you learn. And it is said, and I think you, Mr. Speaker, a former sharer of knowledge, former educator, but maybe still an educator, even maybe in a different way. But teaching is also a very good form of learning and of reinforcing. This year, at the International Labour Conference, there was a debate on the inclusion of occupational safety and health as a fundamental principle and right at work. This matter was on the agenda for the International Labour Conference because a governing body a couple years ago decided that it was important enough to have a full discussion on moving in that direction. And Barbados is the only small island developing state on the governing body of the International Labour Organization. The only small island state sitting on the governing body of the International Labour Organization. And Barbados has been very active in its participation in the ILO and would have added its voice to the call for occupational safety and health to be recognized as a fundamental principle and right at work. During the International Labour Conference, our Chief Labour Officer participated in that discussion specifically and was able to contribute by her voice and her influence to moving that matter forward. And so, Mr. Speaker, occupational safety and health is now recognized by the International Labour Organization, and all member states are now bound to recognize occupational safety and health as a fundamental principle and a right at work. Again, a recognition that people matter, workers matter, their welfare matters because of their humanity. There is still some work to be done. We recognize both in that discussion and also the discussion we had on the social and solidarity economy, the matter of working from home is one that still needs quite a bit of reflection and deliberation. Because designing structures to speak to occupational safety and health in the work environment or in the workplace is a bit easier maybe a lot easier than designing systems that work where the worker is not in a workplace set up, built, managed by the employer. You can't go into a house and say, well, this is the wrong chair or the wrong table, and you shouldn't be sitting on your bed working. It is a different kettle of fish, as we would say in St. Peter. A different kettle of fish, and so it has to be addressed. And I mention that now to say that the discussion on occupational safety and health is not a discussion that has come to a conclusion, but it is an evolving matter. As the world of work changes, our approach to occupational safety and health will also be changing. Sometimes we try to be proactive, but often, maybe too often, we end up being reactive. But it is still a matter that has to be addressed. I, at this point, want to thank my team in the Ministry of Labor, particularly in the Labor Department and in the Safety and Health section. Some of them are here with me this morning, supporting their minister, and I'm very grateful that you are here to lend me some support. I'm very grateful for that. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that these folk work hard. They work hard. The Chief Labor Officer may tell you that sometimes she wonders if I really feel so, or if I'm just saying so. It's because I'm a little bit pushy, but I recognize that a lot of work is done in that department. They struggle with not the amount of resources that maybe would make the work more effective, but with the resources that they have, they do significant work for the benefit of the working people of this country, and I applaud them for that. We also have, Mr. Speaker, in the chamber, and I'm very happy that your office allowed us to have them here. I recognize that this is your place. If it was at the Ministry of Labor, it would have been, quote unquote, my place, but this is your place. And I'm happy that you allow them to come. And they're also here with the officers of the Labor Department, some persons who are aspiring to become attorneys at law, and they are attached to the Ministry of Labor, and in particular the Labor Department, and they've also come. They've actually come having expressed an interest in understanding not just labor legislation, but the process of turning drafts into law. And I'm sure maybe they'll have a chance to speak with you maybe at some point. But I thank them for being here as well and allowing themselves to be exposed to the process to make real what they would have been learning theoretically. I know they also do MOOCs and stuff, but they'll actually see what we do, what the process entails. Now, the reason for the amendments to the Act, the principal reasons for the amendments to the Act, there are a number of amendments that are being made, but I'm going to speak to some principal ones first. The first one I want to mention is a requirement that the certificate of the Chief Fire Officer be displayed in workplaces. The certificate of the Chief Fire Officer. The certificate of the Chief Fire Officer is the certificate, the document that says to all and sundry, this premises, this workplace has been inspected, and from the perspective of those who are professionals in dealing with fires, preventing, putting out, mitigating against, as far as they're concerned, you have passed the inspection. Now, why the Act already speaks to maintaining the certificate in a register. Why are we asking for it to be displayed in a prominent place? Just over 10 years ago, we had a scenario that is still difficult to reflect on, still difficult to come to grips with. We refer to it as the campus trends. Well, it was a disaster. People died. Workers died. There are scores, hundreds of workplaces in this country. And part of the reason for asking for this certificate to be displayed is to engage wider Barbados in the process of ensuring that businesses, workplaces, not all workplaces are businesses, so let me use workplaces. We want to engage Barbadians as inspectors of workplaces. We want, and this is very deliberate, we want Barbadians to go into workplaces and be looking for a fire certificate. We want Barbadians, when they don't see a fire certificate, to raise Cain, raise hell, holler hard. That is what we want, because we want businesses to be compliant. And with the best will in the world, and with all the resources in the world, which is not possible, we are not going to be able to inspect every single workplace on a continuing basis. But we believe that all of us have a vested interest in ensuring that workplaces comply with the highest standards of fire safety. I went and I had the unfortunate experience of going to a business operating about 2 or 3 doors away from campus trains, or away from where campus trains used to operate. I went into the business place. I went to do inspections because that is what we do at the Labor Department, and leaders got to lead by example. I went into that operation, looking around, inspecting, sensitive that it was geographically proximate to campus trains. And I asked about fire extinguishers and if there was a back door. Mr. Speaker, my team and I were directed to the back door. So this is a business that has a back door. Not all businesses in these setups may have a back door, but there are mitigating actions that can be taken in those situations. If the building is not built to accommodate it, nobody says you have to drill through the next door business to create a back door. But this business had a back door. We got to the back door, and there is an outside door with an inside wrought iron door. The inside wrought iron door was chained and padlocked. I immediately assumed that the key must be in the lock. So I look at the lock, but the key is not in the lock. So I asked, where would the key for this padlock be? Mr. Speaker, I was the most horrified person. And whenever I think about this, these are the kinds of things that make me wonder if some people really care about human beings. Mr. Speaker, you may or may not believe this, but I already established that I speak truth. I was told that the key to the padlock that was on that chained inside door was at a branch of the business located in Swan Street. I was on Tudor Street, and I was not close to the junction with Swan Street. But that is some of the kind of, I don't call it nonsensical, inhumane kind of operation that we have to confront. And so in the area of fire safety, having already been through a situation where lives have been lost, I call today for all Barbadians, once we have gazetted, well, no, this is actually in the bill, this is an amendment to the act. Once this act is passed and proclaimed, that whenever you go into a business or wherever you go, when you're going into somebody's place, not a house, but when you're going to somebody's business place, look for the fire certificate. Get some kind of indication that those who operate in that space want to treat to you as a human being and not just as a purveyor of $20 bills and $50 bills or checkbooks. Check to make sure that they are conscious that those who patronize them are human beings and that those who work for them are human beings. That is one of the amendments that is to be brought in this bill. Another, Mr. Speaker, right now there is a bit of a conflict between the Safety and Health at Work Act and one of the health service regulations. And briefly, the particular health service regulation says that in every place where people are employed, the sanitary conveniences must be of a certain specification. Now, the Safety and Health at Work Act says that in situations, for example, where all those who are employed are of the same family, or if they're less than 10 persons employed, that the chief labor officer, well, that they're exempted from the requirement to have separate bathroom facilities for the sexes. The amendment that needs to happen in this, and this was brought to our attention through the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, I think that's how it came to our attention. That potential conflict, and actually, Mr. Speaker, that speaks to one of the things that this government has sought to do since it came into office. The matter of continually reviewing legislation and picking up some of the conflicts, some of the errors of reference, some of which we have to deal with, we are going to be dealing with today. But that conflict, the amendment that is going to be put on the table where that is concerned, will give the Chief Labor Officer some flexibility to vary the requirement based on the exigencies of the business operation. And that is another of the amendments being made, of the significant ones being made today. There's a third one, Mr. Speaker, and I spoke earlier to the fact that this 2005 piece of legislation has always needed regulations. There are areas where normal, decent people have differences of opinion. There are also areas where people who are not normal and not decent seek to find these gray spots to try to do the minimum or not to do what they're supposed to do. As we were preparing the regulations, one of the regulations that has caused a lot of challenges, and I've heard it in my years of practice of people management, the whole matter of the right to refuse dangerous tasks. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Act gives that right to a worker, the right to refuse dangerous tasks. But as an attorney yourself, Mr. Speaker, you can imagine that there must be a couple of hundred definitions to what constitutes a dangerous task. That kind of gray area is one that needs to be addressed. Now, the Act is perfectly fine in terms of providing that opportunity for a worker. That Act, and let me remind us, that Barbados Labour Party Act, in giving the right for a worker to refuse a dangerous task, recognize the agency of the worker. It recognizes that the worker has a brain. It recognizes that a worker can detect if this thing can cause me a problem. When people leave home in the morning or in the afternoon or in the evening to go to work, they go with the expectation that they're going to get back home to their dependents, or they're going to get back home to enjoy their life if there's nobody else in the house with them. Those who live with others, the others, when the worker goes to work, the others expect that person to come back home at the end of their period of work. These are not the days like when the Panama Canal was constructed and during the days of enslavement, where you go to work only to provide labor for those who employ you, or back in those days, those who thought that they owned you. This is a different era. This is a human era. This is not barbaric times. And so there is that understanding that workers must have a level of agency. They must be given the right to say, I am not going to put myself in harm's way. Now, that is fine. But we also recognize that it can't be a free-for-all. There must be some management of that scenario. Otherwise, there could be chaos in workplaces. There could be chaos in workplaces. And so, part of the Amendment Act, the Amendment Bill that we're debating today, is to allow the minister to make a regulation that would give some clarity to that right. It does not reduce, the intention is not to reduce the right. We are certainly not eliminating the right. That right remains. But just like with some other areas, we want to give some clarity, some guidance, so that workers and employers are able to navigate this space called the right to refuse dangerous tasks. At this point, I think there are the sections 105 to 108, the sections of the SHAW Act, the Safety and Health at Work Act. That section allows for the making of regulations, but it does not ascribe to the minister responsible for labor the right to make a regulation in respect of the right to refuse dangerous tasks. And so we are amending the Principal Act, the SHAW Act, to allow for that regulation to be made. And I give the undertaking to this Honourable Chamber, Mr. Speaker, that once this bill becomes law, the Cabinet has already approved that that particular regulation can be made, and once this bill becomes law, then we will proceed to inform the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel so that the regulation can be prepared and put into force. This act also seeks to allow the minister to establish statutory forms and to set fees. But there's no intention at this point, we're not talking about fees. The matter speaks, we're talking about forms. Now, the Factories Act that was repealed by the Safety and Health at Work Act allowed for the making of those forms and the putting of those forms into the space where they had to be used. The Safety and Health at Work Act does not allow for the making of those forms. So maybe an oversight, but it is one that we are correcting in this amendment bill. And so when this amendment bill is passed, it will allow for the making of statutory forms so that the information that is needed by the Safety and Health section of the Labor Department in my ministry will be such that the form allows for the capture of the relevant information. Not a free-for-all, not just a narrative, but a form that says to the employer, this is the information that we need, and this is the format we need it in. And so the ability to establish statutory forms is also a part of this amendment bill. It is also felt, Mr. Speaker, that it is necessary to indicate in the Act, to be specific in the Act, to say that the legislation binds the Crown. That is already inferred in the legislation, sorry, not binds the Crown. My apologies for going back before Independence Day last year. I didn't mean to do that, but sometimes you call the words that you are accustomed to and that we need to break ourselves away from. But implied in some areas of the Act already is an understanding that government agencies, so if I may go, Mr. Speaker, to Section 3 of the Principal Act, the Safety and Health at Work Act. Subsection 1 of Section 3 says that, subject to subsections 3 and 5 of Section 4, the Act applies to all workplaces in Barbados. All workplaces in Barbados. And then in subsection 3, there is maybe it's called a caveat. It speaks to the fact that the Act applies to persons employed by or under any department of the government of Barbados other than the police force, no, the Barbados Police Service, and the Barbados Defense Force. And then such classes as can be specified by the minister by order. So there's already the understanding that government is included under the Safety and Health at Work Act. It is already there. I understand, Mr. Speaker, that those trained like yourself use terms like for the avoidance of doubt. And so for the avoidance of doubt, this bill will include Act 136, Section 136A, a statement that says this Act shall bind the state. And Mr. Speaker, there are some who speak to the challenges that government often faces in relation to some of its accommodation. The term sick buildings came into popular use because of some of those challenges. But we hold the view, Mr. Speaker, this minister And this Barbados Labour Party government, of which I am a proud member, holds the view that we cannot enact legislation for everybody else and we be excluded. Government is one of the largest, if not the largest, employer in this country. And any government that we are a part of must be working toward being a model employer. We must be working toward being a model employer. Now, we are not naive to think that we are there. We are not naive to think we are there. I have not come to this honorable chamber, Mr. Speaker, even to suggest that we are there. But we are on our way. We are on the journey to demonstrating that we can be and will be a model employer in this country. So, we've said before, and many of my colleagues have said this, we don't run away from issues. We hold our own feet to the fire. We are not waiting for others to hold our feet to the fire. We do it ourselves. We put ourselves under the microscope. We hold ourselves to the highest standards, and we will hold ourselves to the highest standards as an employing organization. The government of Barbados, as an employer, will be held to the highest standards. Where we are deficient, we will work to improve. We recognize that we are not where we want to be, and we are not where we ought to be. But we will work to get to that place. There are a number of other changes, other amendments, Mr. Speaker, that are not as major, but I'm just going to go through a couple of them. There are some changes, and I indicated that when we have the review mechanism in place, some of these will be picked up. We had, for example, in a number of places, we had the term highly inflammable. And maybe that was a result of not understanding the definition of the term. And I have to admit that after so many years of school, I did not know that inflammable meant highly flammable. When I see in as a prefix, I believe that it diminishes or reduces or removes. But I learned in this process that highly inflammable was bad English, and that the word should be highly flammable or inflammable. As a matter of fact, I think that maybe because of my limited intelligence, rather than using inflammable, because I believe it was felt that people like me still may get confused, the Chief Parliamentary Counsel's office decided to help people like me, and we are going to use highly flammable. That helps me. I believe it will help my constituents, because these things are sometimes only for those who have a lot of stuff between their ears. So that is that change represents a number of the amendments. Maybe 3 or 4 places it is mentioned in the Act. There are also a couple of places in the Act where other subsections were to be captured. So, for example, at Section 36, subsection D, it speaks to the length of time within which occupier of a workplace is to comply. It includes section 33 and 35, but it neglected to include section 37. And so section 37 is to be included in that paragraph, in that clause 36. in 64, 63, there's a reference to section 85. That should have been section 86. And so that is being amended also to correct that. Maybe a typographical error. There is also a reference in section 79, subsection 4, to a section 32. That section, that reference, is to be changed to section 33. Again, another typographical error. There is at section 93 a reformatting to give greater clarity to the section. And this is a section that speaks to the keeping of what is called a general register, a place where, and when we say a general register, I had some discussion, I almost had some little fights with the chief labor officer. But she made me to understand, register could be in paper form, it could be in electronic form, it's still a register. I was feeling smart that I wanted a word that meant only electronic. But there are organizations in this country that still use paper. But register means either paper form or electronic form. And there's a rewording, a restructuring of that paragraph. Nothing of substance changes, but it makes it easier to read in law. And so, Mr. Speaker, those are the amendments in summary. Now, section 108, which I spoke to earlier, that gives the minister the authority to make regulations. Those regulations that I spoke to earlier, which include the right to refuse dangerous tasks, the right to prescribe statutory forms, and the right to set fees, those will be included under section 108, and 3 new clauses will be added to include those amendments, and those clauses will become clauses H or subclause H, I, and J. What is also to be amended in this piece of legislation, and this is now going from section 109, the Act speaks to owner, and the Act speaks, in some cases, to occupier. Owner, occupier. We do know, and I know that eminent attorneys at law like yourself are aware of this, that people set up all kinds of companies, and sometimes it is difficult even for officers in the Labor Department to figure out who is the real employer. So you hear that this company is operating in this space, is renting from some other company, but the people who work are actually employed by somebody else. They're actually employed by somebody else. And these kinds of, I almost said shenanigans, but that may not be fair. These kinds of corporate constructs sometimes, oftentimes, make it difficult for issues to be resolved, especially when the characters involved are not decent people. So they hide behind and hide behind and hide behind. One of the amendments being made, well, an amendment that is being made in a number of places in this Act will add the term employer, so that in section 109, clause 1 of that, or subsection 1 of that, the word employer will be added. At subsection 3, employer will be added, so we get owner, occupier, employer, because we need to make sure that as we look after the health and the safety and the welfare of our workers, that we know who we can speak to, and that those who we need to engage are not hiding behind some construction in law that allows them to evade their responsibility or avoid their responsibility. And so we will be adding the term employer, because in the Safety and Health at Work Act, in this legislation, there are responsibilities on each of those: owners, occupiers, and those who employ the workers who work in the organization. The regulations, Mr. Speaker, while they do not come to Parliament, I still think that it is incumbent upon me to share with this honorable chamber, because this is where the representatives of the people sit. And through sharing in this chamber, to share with the public, to share with Barbadians and Barbadian workers in particular, generally, what these regulations will be speaking to. Now, I already shared about the right to refuse dangerous tasks, and I already mentioned that that regulation has not yet been prepared because there's no authority to prepare it. Statutory forms, none of those have been set out because there's no authority to do so. But there is authority to make some others. The Act actually, between sections 105 and 108, allows for the making of many, 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 many regulations. But we have selected a number of them, 8 to be exact, that we will focus on at this time. We believe that these are important. These 8, along with the right to refuse dangerous tasks, which will come later, but these 8 are important enough that we need to focus on them immediately. And so very, very shortly, the instruments will be signed and gazetted. But to allow this honorable chamber and the public to understand, just let me share briefly. There is to be established what we call a drinking water regulation. The proper title is the Safety and Health at Work Drinking Water, in brackets, Regulations 2022. That is what it will be called, but I'll use the short name for the time being. This drinking water regulation, and I should, before I go into that, let me repeat something that I've said in this honorable chamber many times before. A government is driven to enact legislation and to establish regulations only because there are those who refuse to do the right thing. That's the only reason. Otherwise, I certainly wouldn't put the Labor Department, we wouldn't put the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel through working day and sometimes into the night, trying to get these things done if they weren't necessary. And today is not the day to name and shame, but we have to set up and set out a regulation for drinking water. We have to set up a regulation that says I sometimes just speak what comes to my mind. I look out of my window this morning. One of my neighbors has a cow. And he was giving water to the cow because he recognizes that outside gets hot and that if the cow is to remain healthy, the cow needs water. When I was growing up, I had to take water for the goats. We kept goats. I had to take water for the goats. The honorable member for Christchurch West Central still keeps goats. and still gives water to his goats. Now, I say that, and the reason why I hesitated a little bit is because I don't feel comfortable trying to create an equivalence, because there's no equivalence intended. But I'm saying that I feel almost bad having to bring a drinking water regulation to put it into effect when those who keep animals know that they have to give water to their animals. Now, human beings can become dehydrated. Global warming tells us that outside getting hotter, but we feel it. Outside it's getting hotter. Europe had its hottest summer in 40 or 50 years, just I think a month or two ago. So that there's a regulation that says you must provide water where there is no connection to a public supply. If you're in a building where there are taps and water fountains, well, you're already providing water. If you're out on a site somewhere, you need to get a clean container, put it in a clean place, and cover it down. That is, in essence, what the regulation says. And when it comes into force, what it will say. A clean container, a container that has a means of dispensing, so some kind of spout or nozzle or something, it has to be in a clean place, and it got to be covered down. So the same thing you do in your house, you do when you employ people and you put them to work in a place where there is no connection to the public supply. That is the drinking water regulation, because we recognize that people work far from buildings. Construction sites sometimes don't have water set up immediately. People work in quarries. People work all over the place in agriculture. And one of the things that this government has come to office to do, and it was pretty clearly set out in our 2018 manifesto, is to look after forgotten people. We have come to office to look after the working people of this country. There's also, Mr. Speaker, a regulation that is referred to as the General Duties Regulation. Now, this is an interesting one because it says and will say to all and sundry that not just the owner of the business and those who manage the business, but those who supply materials and equipment and furnishings and furniture to the business also have a responsibility for the safety, health, and welfare of people who work in the organization. So, in other words, Mr. Speaker, you are not able to sell junk to a company, a chair that's going to crash if a baby sits down in it. You cannot sell that to an organization that is employing people and get away with it. You will have some responsibility. Some level of culpability will be yours if you do that. So it extends this matter of protecting the safety, health, and welfare of workers to persons who are supplying items that will be used by those workers. It says to those who are suppliers that while we expect that businesses will generate profits at the end of the day, and maybe that is not the correct term, at the beginning of the day, you ought to recognize that these items are being supplied to a place or an organization where human beings spend time working. And so your perspective has to be on ensuring that that which you supply for the use by human beings will be fit for human beings to occupy, to use, and to do so in a safe manner. That is the General Duties Regulation. There is also, Mr. Speaker, a noise regulation. And this regulation, I think most people understand that noise damages your ears. Even those who at this time of the year are going to lean up against speakers, but those who do that because that's what they want to do. But if you leave home to go to earn a living, you really don't expect that at the end of 5 or 10 years, you have to say, well, because of my work, trying to feed myself and my family or my dependents, I now can no longer hear. And so the regulation, and that regulation is an interesting one. I saw some scientific notations that I was not familiar with. But it sets out those levels that are acceptable, not acceptable, and the fact that mitigating factors will need to be in place. One of the things that I'll mention, there is something called dBAs, that is A-rated decibels. And the understanding is that we shouldn't go above 85 A-rated decibels. Anything over that has the potential to cause hearing loss. And so we are being very particular in the regulation so that organizations, employing organizations, know what they're supposed to do at what levels. Testing has to be done. Persons who are continually exposed to noise, those workers have to be tested at no cost to the worker, and records of the results of those tests have to be maintained so that any person acting under the authority of the Chief Labor Officer is able to inspect those records whenever it is determined that those records need to be inspected. And so that speaks to the noise regulation. There's also, Mr. Speaker, a regulation to speak to PPE, personal protective equipment. Now, PPE, the term, has come into vogue since the pandemic. PPE was always something that the officers in the Labor Department and the Safety and Health section always address, a matter they always address, the provision of PPE. But there was no regulation, even though the Act recognizes that PPE is to be provided. There was no recognition, and in an Act, you cannot explain everything that you can explain in a regulation. And that is the reason why you have regulations to accompany Acts. And so, the understanding, and this will tie into the right to refuse dangerous tasks as well, because if you don't have the correct PPE, then that right becomes very necessary. But this regulation will speak to the fact that you need PPE when you're exposed to a variety of hazards. There's noise, you may need earplugs, earmuffs, microwaves, laser, biological agents, chemical agents, falling hazards. There are a number of things that call for the provision of PPE, and the regulation will be clear on those matters. I want to include here, Mr. Speaker, that in this regulation, we have added the provision of rain protection for persons who may be exposed to rain. And again, I go back to our 2018 manifesto, this Barbados Labour Party, this party in government that is rooted and grounded in the protection of workers. We've heard the cry of persons who work at some petrol stations, who work in the forecourt. And when the rain comes down, when they have to move back and forth with money, sometimes rain protection is not provided. We refer to some of these categories of workers as the forgotten ones, because it seems as though nothing was happening for them. But this Barbados Labour Party instituted a minimum wage that improved their standard of living. This Barbados Labour Party, through the PPE regulation, will also insist that whenever there's a possibility of exposure to rain, rain protection must be provided. Must be provided. And so those persons who work in petrol stations, I'm saying to you that we have been hearing you and we continue to respond to you because we have a responsibility to lift up workers and to protect the workers of this country. There is also the understanding, and with all rights come responsibilities. Workers have the responsibility to look after the PPE. And some will say, and I know this from experience, every now and then you have to tell somebody, I cannot provide boots for you, and you wear them to work 5 days a week, and break jobs 2 days a week, and use the same boots, and then in 3 months tell me that the boots mash up. Not if I buy good Timberlands for you. So what we are saying is that there is a responsibility. PPE has to be provided once there are risks or hazards to be mitigated against. And once other means of mitigating elimination is one, and the other means, PPE, the experts tell me, is really the last thing that you want to do. There are other elimination or mitigating factors you want to use first. But if we get to the point where PPE is necessary, then once that personal protective equipment is provided, it is expected that those who are using it, the workers, will take care of the equipment. What is also in the regulation is that if PPE is going to be used by more than one person, there's a responsibility on the employer to make sure that we don't have a situation where somebody is using something that is dirty from a previous use. And this has become, I think, much more relevant now when we are in a period of time where we are thinking about viruses passing from one person to another on surfaces. And so there's a responsibility on the part of the employer to make sure that the PPE is clean and fit for use by the person who will be using it after the initial person. Sanitary conveniences, toilet facilities. Attorneys like to use nicer terms derived from the Latin, that kind of thing. We call it toilets in St. Peter. In this regulation, we call it sanitary conveniences. And I use the word that most people know because I don't want anybody to misunderstand what sanitary conveniences really is referring to. But it will include urinals as well, or troughs. It could include those as well. But Mr. Speaker, we came to office, and in this honorable chamber, whether located in this geographical space or in Worthing, we spoke quite a lot about the fact that we face an untenable situation where persons, especially the mothers of this country, the working mothers of this country, were forced to go into the bush to relieve themselves. And Mr. Speaker, to think that in the 21st century, that still happens is a little bit mind-boggling. We recognize as a government, we recognize as a ministry that we have to be very, very clear to the fact that sanitary conveniences, places where a person can release waste, go to the toilet, go to the bathroom, must be provided wherever those persons are working. It is a basic need. the body, you don't control, well, sometimes you do, to your detriment, your release. And I would want to say to the men in this honorable chamber that the doctors, the physicians say that when you try to hold for too long, you do damage. I don't know if the Minister of Health will agree with me, but you can do damage to some very vital organs. When your body asks to release, you ought to be able to release, not to get on a cart, but not to find the driver, to get on a cart, to drive 10 or 15 minutes or even 5 minutes to get to a place where you can relieve yourselves. And so one of the regulations will speak to the sanitary conveniences. I already spoke to the potential conflict or the conflict that existed between the Health Service Regulation and the Safety and Health at Work Act, which we are addressing, recognizing that some smaller organizations and family-owned organizations may not need to go to a certain point, but leaving that discretion not to the employer, not to the business owner, but to the honest broker, the Office of the Chief Labor Officer. And so these sanitary conveniences have to be provided. I congratulate the Honourable Member for St. Philip South, who, before this regulation, has ensured that where government is concerned, toilet facilities, mobile toilet facilities, have been provided for agricultural workers in this country. That is what it means, Mr. Speaker, when I say that this government intends to be a model employer. We will hold ourselves to high standards because our soul is bound up in promoting the welfare of and protecting the workers, the working people of this country. Another regulation will address washing facilities, and this is particularly important when dealing with what are called hazardous, noxious substances that can mash up the skin. You know, that's how ordinary people see these things. We as ordinary people, things that can destroy your skin, you need to have the ability to wash off. So you use your PPE, but at the end of your shift, we expect that there be facilities to allow for the washing of hands, feet, face, any exposed areas. There must be facilities to wash. Now, these facilities must have soap, and not soap provided by the worker, soap provided by the employer. And just let me be very clear. We are not talking about bar soap. I don't know, Mr. Speaker, if the people of Bank Hall call it that. Don't say, we talk bar soap. We are not talking about bar soap because we recognize that bar soap gets dirty. And so the soap must be foam or liquid soap. A means of drying surfaces, hands or feet or face, must also be there. And the water must be able to obviously drain away and not settle in a pool for other people to have to stand in it while they are washing. Again, this is a regulation pursuant to the Act, but one that intends to make it absolutely clear what is expected of any employer of human beings. To make it clear what we expect, that these workers must be treated as human beings and they must be protected. So that is the washing facilities regulations. There is also, Mr. Speaker, a workstations regulation, Years ago, there was a lot of discussion about carpal tunnel. Carpal tunnel syndrome, one of the things that we ought not to do, one of the mistakes we ought not to make, is to allow these matters to become flavors of the day. Things that affect human beings, that affect our workers, our working people, must not be allowed to become the flavor of the day, the headline for today, but not for tomorrow. And so there is still the matter of musculoskeletal disorders, repetitive strains, and those kinds of matters. And those are scenarios that still have to be addressed. The matter of correct heights, proper keyboards, those are matters that must be addressed. Risks must be assessed in these situations. There must be examinations. And all employers must be able to demonstrate to the Chief Labor Officer that they have assessed these situations and have set up their workstations to suit. In other words, this regulation calls for employers always to be thinking about their workers. What is it that could cause harm? How can I make adjustments so that harm is not caused? There's also the matter of being able to take breaks. There are some people, some workers in this country, Mr. Speaker, who spend all of their working day in front of a computer. Now, doing that without a break or with only a break for lunch is unhealthy. It will affect quality of life, if not immediately, at some point down the road. And so this regulation will allow for periodic breaks when a person is expected to be at a workstation for more than 6 hours a day or more than 30 hours a week. Periodic breaks so a person can get up, stretch their legs, walk about, and make sure that the ill that could attend repetitive strain, if there's not that break, is reduced, or the possibility of becoming ill is reduced. And that is the gist of the workstations regulation. There's also, Mr. Speaker, and here I return to the many men, but probably mostly ladies, who work at petrol stations. Again, and I repeat, who have felt neglected, who have felt overlooked over the years. I spoke earlier to the minimum wage. I spoke earlier to the provision of rain protection. I speak now specifically to medical supervision, a regulation that will be termed fuel stations medical supervision. Those of us who are privileged enough to go to the petrol station to put in gas sometimes speak about the smell, sometimes speak to feeling nauseous, sometimes ask, I wonder what to put in this. Sometimes wonder if the attendant has spilled some of the gas outside of the tank. And we are aware of how strong it smells. We are aware of how we feel after inhalation. There are some studies that indicate that prolonged exposure could cause challenges. I am not, and because I'm careful that oftentimes, Hansard will be used to determine subsequent events. I cannot say to you, Mr. Speaker, that the evidence is conclusive. It may be, or it may be for some. But there is that feeling in the scientific community that there are harmful effects to prolonged exposure. And so, Mr. Speaker, having heard the petrol station attendants, this government will be putting into force a fuel stations medical supervision regulation that will require periodic medical examinations for those who work in fuel stations. It will include the appropriate blood tests, urine tests, and liver function tests. Those are the areas where the scientific community at this point indicate that there could be damage, possible damage, and so in an effort to make sure that the health of our workers is protected, we are saying to all operators of fuel stations, that includes petrol stations, it also includes places where bulk fuel is moved from one place to another, or one storage area to another. So we call it fuel stations as opposed to petrol stations. And there will be a requirement that at no cost to the worker, there will be these annual medical examinations. We have to make sure that the human beings in this country who work are protected. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say to you and to say to the country that these are eminently reasonable. Reasonable because we are dealing with human beings. Human beings. Now, I want, before I take my seat, to reflect on one or two things. There is the feeling, and I know the feeling because I've worked in larger organizations, I've worked in smaller organizations, I've owned and managed a mini mart. There is sometimes the feeling that once you hear a law or regulation, it means that a smaller operator is now going to be put close to having to close down the business because you're asking for so much. The regulation that speaks to sanitary conveniences, for example, that may immediately trigger, well, I got to now lick down this wall and build this. And if your complement, your team, your workers, if they're less than 10, the chief labor officer will have a certain level of flexibility. These regulations are not intended in any way to put anybody out of business. These regulations are meant to be reasonable accommodations for human beings who work to ensure that businesses are viable and beyond viable, profitable. Drinking water. I use what for me was not the best illustration already. So I'm not even going there. If you're going to give your cow and your sheep and your goat water, then I'm going to leave that right there. I don't care how small an operation you are. You must be able to find a flask somewhere in town and provide water, if it is as small as a flask. So I'm not going in that direction. PPE. Now, when a business buys a truck or a van, it could be a Suzuki Carry, it could be a Light Ace, When you buy a cash register, when you buy a refrigerator, there are certain things that a business, however large, however small, will do. So if you buy a Light Ace, a Town Ace, a Suzuki Carry, from time to time, Mr. Speaker, you will take it to get the air, the tires checked. You will know that you have to put coolant in. You will check to make sure that there is oil in the engine. And every now and then, maybe as you could afford, or you may follow these specifications and do it every 3 or 6 months, you will have it serviced. All organizations involved in commercial activity, however large, however small, looks after its vehicles. You have a fridge or air conditioning unit. When you realize that it is not cooling the way it ought to, you call somebody to check the filter. If when they check the filter, it's still not cooling properly, you may engage somebody else who may tell you, oh, it needs gassing. I don't know what the scientific term is, but that's what we call it. It needs gassing. And you will provide gas for it. If you, Mr. Speaker, are in landscaping and using a whacker, there comes a point in time when you got to put the correct fuel in. And those who put the wrong fuel, and I've seen a couple of those who put the wrong fuel go to the gas station and don't mix the thing, and put the wrong fuel in, mash up the whacker. So even those who own whackers are careful to look after their whackers. Even those whose only piece of equipment, in other words, such a small operation that the only piece of equipment is a whacker, they will take care of the whacker. You know, I have mentioned those things for one reason. Matters like PPE, and I have been part of negotiations in a previous life that spent so much time trying to negotiate whether or not the feet of human beings should be protected in a place where hot water can spill, where hot oil can spill. Whether the employer, the owner, the occupier had any responsibility whatsoever to the people who are helping to generate the profits of the business, whether or not the feet of those people should be protected. When I reflect on it, I begin to wonder, well, let me not say that. Nobody knows the future. I am saying, Mr. Speaker, that when we are discussing protecting workers, there has to be a recognition that a human being is of more value biblically than a sparrow, commercially than a whacker, than an AC unit, than a car or a van. A worker is a human being. If a business operator is going to go to the lengths that that business operator will go to protect and preserve inanimate objects, that business owner, operator, employer must be willing to do what is necessary and what is reasonable to protect the human beings who work in that space. End of story. For sanitary conveniences, toilet paper, soap, and a trash can. If your business is not able to afford toilet paper, soap, and a trash can, your business model needs to be examined. I could have helped you with that, but as a minister, I cannot take on extra work. But your business model, if to provide toilet paper, soap, and water. Even the last government, Mr. Speaker, provided toilet paper. They had to borrow to buy toilet paper, but they recognized that they had to provide toilet paper, and they borrowed to do it. And some of those same wicked people are asking about us borrowing to provide garbage trucks and buses, but I stray. Toilet paper, soap, and trash cans. If your business can't provide it, you're in the wrong business or you have the wrong business model. If for drinking water, you cannot provide a receptacle and some paper cups, wrong business model. If for washing facilities, you cannot provide a standpipe, and standpipe is actually mentioned. We're not asking for anything fancy. If you cannot provide a standpipe, or a shower or a basin, a faucet in a basin, wash basin, or a trough, you're in the wrong business. These regulations, Mr. Speaker, I believe are reasonable in protecting the workers of this country, but also reasonable as it pertains to those who are involved in business. These regulations recognize that not all businesses are equal in terms of economic might. These regulations are not intended to put any kind of business out of business. These regulations are here and will be put into force, and those that the amendment that we debate today eventually will allow us to make will be made and are being made from the simple recognition, two principal areas of recognition. One is that workers are human beings, and I've said that a million times already today, but Mr. Speaker, I will never tire of saying it. Regulations acknowledge that workers are human beings. Secondly, and also importantly, these regulations acknowledge that the human beings who work, whether for commercial enterprises or for civil society organizations in the third sector or for government, workers who expend their labor do so to earn to support themselves and their dependents, but they also do that in a cause that allows organizations to be viable and to be profitable. And so if a worker is going to give optimally of his or her labor, then that worker must be in a position to give optimally of his or her labor. That worker then must be a healthy worker. That worker must be operating in a safe environment. And that worker must be operating in an environment where his or her welfare is being taken seriously. I submit to you, Mr. Speaker, today, that if, as we deal with, and I say we because government is also an employer, I'm speaking now as part of government, if we are going to look after our vehicles, if we are going to look after our equipment, if we are going to look after our furnishings, and we're going to keep them in good order, then we have to be prepared to look after the eyes of our workers, to protect the eyes of our workers. We have to be prepared to protect the hearing of our workers. We have to be prepared to protect the heads of our workers from possibility of falling objects. We must be willing to protect the hands and arms of our workers. We must be willing and able to protect the feet of our workers. We must be willing to take seriously our responsibility as protectors of life and limb. We have to recognize that those who go to work or those who come to work do so in an effort to lead fulfilled lives, to feel as though they're contributing to the development of an organization, and through that organization, the development of a society. They must be respected and protected as they seek to provide for themselves and those who depend on them. There has to be the understanding that every worker has others who are expecting that they will continue to be productive, and so as productive people able to contribute. We have to be much more sensitive to the fact that the human beings who work in this country, that the human beings who work in our organizations are human beings like ourselves. And we must get to the point where we are willing to do unto others as we would want those others to do to us, to treat people the way we would want to be treated, to be our brothers and our sisters' keepers, simply because we share a common humanity. And with those words, Mr. Speaker, I commend the Safety and Health at Work Amendment Bill 2022 to this Honourable Chamber. I ask that the Chamber, composed as it is, completely by those who have inherited a responsibility to be advocates for the working people of this country, for those who sit in this place who have accepted the call to be protectors and promoters of workers in this country. I commend this bill to the public, recognizing that this bill speaks to us, hearing you, hearing workers, understanding their plight, and putting systems in place to address any challenges that there may be. I commend this bill, therefore, to all of us and ask that this bill be read a second time.
Honourable Member for St. Joseph.
I believe you have a seconder, sir. Beg to second that. Mr. Speaker, I would like to move the adjournment of the House for an hour and 15 minutes.
Suspension, Honourable.
Suspension of the House for around 15 minutes, so we would therefore resume at 1:50? 1:50.
The question is that this honorable chamber be suspended until 1:50 p.m. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. This honorable chamber stands suspended until 1:50 p.m.